It was West who first noticed the falling plaster on that part of the wall where the ancient tomb masonry had been covered up. I was going to run, but he stopped me. Then I saw a small black aperture, felt a ghoulish wind of ice, and smelled the carnal bowels of putrescent earth. There was no sound, but just then the electric lights went out, and I saw outlined against some phosphorescence of the netherworld a horde of silent, toiling things which only insanity, or worse, could create. Their outlines were human, semi-human, fractionally human, and not human at all. The horde was grotesquely heterogeneous. They were removing the stones quietly, one by one, from the sentried wall, and then, as the breach became large enough, they came out into the laboratory in single file, led by a stalking thing with a beautiful head made of wax. A sort of mad-eyed monstrosity behind the leader seized on Herbert West. West did not resist or utter a sound. Then they all sprang at him and tore him to pieces before my eyes, bearing the fragments away into the subterranean vault of fabulous abominations. West's head was carried off by the wax-headed leader, who wore a Canadian officer's uniform. As it disappeared, I saw that the blue eyes behind the spectacles were hideously blazing with their first touch of frantic, visible emotion. Hello, 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 as the people of Brood Hollow say. Welcome back to Lovecraft Sundays during the CarnyPop DailyDrop. So today we are going to talk about Herbert West Reanimator. This story kinda blows. The section I read you doesn't blow, but most of the story kinda sucks. So let's get this plot summary out of the way real quick. There is a guy who thinks that we can reanimate corpses, and his full thing is that our personalities, there's no such thing as a soul. There's not even such thing as our personality in our brain. We're just our bodies, and he wants to be able to reanimate corpses. So that's not the narrator, that's the narrator's friend. Typical Lovecraft fashion, we have a very active force and then an observer. This time the observer is so close, though, that they're almost an active force. So in this story, this guy goes from being a med student to eventually being a doctor to eventually working in the war to coming home from the war. And all of this, he starts getting more and more intense with his experiments. And there are some cool ideas in here. There's all of the worming around the various restrictions that the people put on them, where the dean kind of shuts down what they do. And then the dean dies of the, I forget what disease it is. It's not plague, obviously, and it's not, might be, I don't know, typhoid or, I don't know. I don't know what the disease is, but there's an epidemic of it, and the dean of the college dies from it. And this Herbert West decides to make him one of his experiments, and he does reanimate him. But something that he finds out at that point, and that's been toyed with throughout, is that if you don't reanimate someone almost immediately after they die, then you won't be able to keep their brain intact. And they will just be a degenerate ape, basically. The other big thing about this is that he needed to practice on cadavers, because each serum that does this spooky reanimation thing only works on the species that it's designed for. So, like, he initially practiced on, like, you know, rats and stuff, and they got up just fine, but when he injected that into a cadaver, nothing happened, so he realized that it's by species. So that's the beginning of the story, is all of these, like, levels of it. And then as it gets more and more intense, the narrator starts to realize that, oh fuck, I'm in too deep with what's going on. My friend is a deranged madman who wants to do nothing but push his experiments forward. There's one point where Herbert West lies about a man having a heart attack on their doorstep, and it's just like, oh my god, I'm so lucky, I got a specimen that's super fresh. We can't let this go. We need to use our good fortune. And then when the guy does reanimate, he tries to strangle Herbert West because he just says, "Get away from me with that needle." Because what he did was stick him with a serum that puts him in a coma state. Also, not the only time we see the good old coma serum in Lovecraft. Definitely happens another time. We'll get to that way later, I'm pretty sure. So, most of the story, though, the thing is that it's written in parts. And I believe it was published serialized. And it's written in parts, and each part repeats the basic conceit of the story. So every time there's a new part, it has to explain to you that there's Herbert West, this medical student, who's reanimating corpses. And there's the narrator, who's his friend and compatriot in nefarious dealings. And they've done all this stuff. And it doesn't do a full recap every time, but it gets really tiresome to hear the basic premise of the story repeated over and over and over. I think there's like 7 parts. So that hinders it a lot. The other thing is that once it gets to the war, it's kind of muddy. Like, suddenly Herbert West isn't just about reanimating people. He's just about doing crazy bullshit. Like, at one point, he just starts growing lizard cells. He's like, yeah, look at this. I can make a whole pile of fucking lizard limbs exist without a head. Like, I can just grow them. And I'm doing it because it's cool. Like, he kind of goes off the deep end a little bit, and he's not that interesting as a result. The climax, though, I really like. This, like, ending, the very end. And this all happens because in the war, one of they're working, this is the Great War, so World War I. They are doctors in World War I. And their, like, commanding medic dies. And they get access to his corpse. Fresh. And Herbert West Reanimator wants to finally show that there is nothing, that he can reanimate a body without a head, and it will have all of its consciousness. Which we know wouldn't really make any sense, given our current understanding of science fiction, but that doesn't really matter. Like, this is what this guy's quest was, and trying to show that there's nothing essentially us in terms of, like, a soul or things like that. That it's all just held in this corporeal body, like I said before. So he cuts off the guy's head, and he sets him up to reanimate, and then they get bombed. The place they are in gets bombed by planes. And nothing is recovered. The man's body is not found. But his head in a suitcase, well, no. That's later. His body is not found. Now, fast forward, Herbert West and his friend both live in this lab, live in this place that is literally right next to a graveyard. And they are trying all the time to do this nefarious crap. Then we get a story about I think it's read in the paper, about some assailant that goes into a museum. And he has this perfect, beautiful head, and he's carrying a suitcase. And then he is shown that his head is wax, and there's maybe something coming from the suitcase. Which, that is the thing we saw at the end. The thing that happens at the end is that the commanding officer who they reanimated, who so desperately hates the fact that he's been reanimated, but was smart enough to be able to look at Herbert West's notes from the wreckage of the bombing and learn how to reanimate things, makes an army of weird ghoul creatures, humans, animals, hybrids, whatever the fuck he decided to do. So he makes a whole army of those, which also, huge power creep here. Like, huge power creep and a problem within its own story, where at the beginning it's so fucking hard to reanimate stuff. Like, it is so difficult, and you need to have just the right serum, and it's such a big deal to be able to reanimate the human. And then Lovecraft just kind of loses control of it and is just like, yeah, what the fuck ever. It's really Dragon Ball to Dragon Ball Z type shit, you know what I mean? Like the Kamehameha wave being a big deal in Dragon Ball, and then suddenly, everybody can Kamehameha wave, everybody can do this, everyone's way stronger than you'd expect. It's that same type of shit. This is just like, you suddenly can reanimate whatever the fuck you pick up off the ground, basically. So that kind of bugs me. There's a lot about it that bugs me. What doesn't bug me is the section that I read, because I'm going to be honest. Even though most of this story sucks, I think it's almost worth reading. Like, a lot of it is not enjoyable. But when you read through it, and it takes you so long because it's a novella that repeats itself in places, and you're just kind of ho-humming around, and then you get to the sequence that I just read to you, you suddenly wake up and you go, all right, Lovecraft, okay. I don't know why it took us so long to get here, but I was not aware that in my Lovecraft story, I was going to get to see a man carrying his head in a suitcase, who has a wax head replacing it, have a bunch of ghouls and weirdos open up a mausoleum that is connected, like open up the wall of a basement, which is connected to a crypt, kidnap the dude, and then what I didn't read, what the rest of that is that while the narrator is fainted, they put the entire wall back together and make him look like a crazy person. Because no one believes him about anything. Any of the reanimation stuff. These guys literally just march in, nab the guy, and fucking leave, and they make it look like the other guy is crazy. And honestly, that was like super good for me. I thought that was hype as hell. And that's the thing. Occasionally Lovecraft is... One of the reasons I love his writing is that there's all of these high concepts and big ideas and all of this really, really out there enriching stuff. And then occasionally he just writes something because it's fucking cool, you know? Like, Lovecraft didn't love this story a lot. And if I wrote this story, I wouldn't love it a lot either. But I think that the climax is definitely still worth it. But I think it's pretty much the only thing that's worth it about the story. So if you have the time to read this one to get the full effect, maybe go ahead and do it. But if you just want to read the good parts, you can definitely start a couple pages back from where I started reading, and then read to the end. And you'll get a good experience. So that's it for Herbert West Reanimator. And this is CarnyPop, signing off. Bye.